You are Lucius Annaeus Seneca, one of the sharpest minds in the empire, a Stoic philosopher and the right-hand man of Emperor Nero. You are trying to focus on eternal truths, but your apartment sits directly above a public bathhouse. From below comes a kind of hellish symphony, the slap of masseurs' hands on oily backs, the shouts of vendors selling pastries, and the worst sound of all, the squeals of customers having their armpit hair ripped out with tweezers. And the noise is only half the problem. Seneca is choking on the smell, a thick, sticky mix of sweat, rancid oil, and damp air. The great philosopher pinches his nose and realizes the cruel irony. What Romans called the peak of civilization and cleanliness is, in reality, a stinking pit. Behind the marble facades and bright white togas, the empire was literally drowning in its own filth.
Forget for a moment the white marble Rome from films where fountains sparkle in every shot. In the early days, in the 6th to the 4th centuries BC, the Eternal City was essentially an overgrown, dusty, and unbelievably smelly settlement. 50, perhaps 100,000 people were packed into a maze of crooked streets, and they all shared one humiliating problem. They were desperately thirsty. A Roman morning in that era began as a fight to survive. The sun was already baking the roof tiles, and the first task was simple: find water just to make it to midday. There were exactly 2 options, and both were terrible. The first was a well in the courtyard, but Rome stands on hills. The ground here is unpredictable. In the dry season, when heat seems to melt stone, the water drops deep underground. The bucket scrapes the bottom and comes up with nothing but thin brown muck.
The second option was the Tiber. The city's main river was shallow, fast, and even then, brutally polluted. Rain washed manure from pastures into it, waste from tanneries, and dirty runoff from the hills. Drinking from the Tiber meant playing a deadly lottery with your own intestines. The city was suffocating. Rome wanted to grow. The Senate dreamed of temples reaching the sky, but everything crashed into basic biology. You cannot build a Colosseum if your workers are lying in the street with dysentery. Without a reliable water supply, Rome was doomed to remain a regional backwater. Everything changed in the year 312 BC. Enter Appius Claudius Caecus, a censor, a hard political operator, a man with a bulldog grip. He understood a simple truth that generals had missed. The people needed more than victories over the Samnites. The people needed water in their jugs.
Appius launched a project that sounded insane for its time: the Aqua Appia, the first aqueduct. It was not just a ditch, but an engineering marvel about 16 kilometers long, and it ran almost entirely underground, not for beauty, but so that enemies could not cut the city's lifeline during a siege. The moment a stream burst from a stone spout in the cattle market, the filthiest marketplace in the city, history shifted. Clean, icy, crystal-clear water arrived from underground springs many miles away. To ordinary citizens, it felt like magic. Appius Claudius became a demigod overnight, and he showed the elite a new path to power. Before, to become great, you had to drag a pile of enemy heads back to Rome. Now, you could lay a pipeline. Water became political currency. Control the flow, and you control the crowd. After Appius died, a real water fever began.
Every ambitious politician, every emperor felt obligated to outdo the last. You built a 20-kilometer channel, I will build 60. Your aqueduct is underground, mine will run on arches as tall as a 10-story building so everyone can see my greatness. By the 1st century AD, 11 giant stone tentacles were reaching toward the capital. The system's total length approached 500 kilometers. It was an engineering triumph. There was now an indecent, almost provocative amount of water. It poured day and night from hundreds of public fountains, and it never stopped. There were no taps to shut it off, And honestly, nobody wanted them. Any beggar could walk up, wash, and drink some of the best water on earth. The Romans got drunk on this abundance. They believed they had conquered nature, put Neptune, the god of waters, in chains. But they did not realize that, along with that crystal freshness, an invisible enemy was starting to enter their lives. And the problem was not the springs, it was what they used to carry the water.
Now let us deal with a popular myth. People say the Roman Empire collapsed not because barbarians were stronger and not because of corruption. Supposedly, the Romans simply went mad from lead poisoning. They built lead pipes, drank the water, and ended up with mass dementia and infertility. It sounds neat, but if you dig deeper, the story becomes far more frightening and far more complicated. Lead was everywhere, a universal, cheap, incredibly convenient material. The Romans called it plumbum, and that is where the word plumbing comes from. They were obsessed with it. They used lead not only for pipes, fistulae. Fashionable women used it to whiten their faces. They cast small statues, toys, and weights for scales out of it. But its most outrageous use appeared in the kitchen. Cooks discovered a strange chemical trick. If you boiled sour grape must in a lead pot, it became sweet.
The process produced lead acetate, lead sugar. People added this deadly syrup, called sapa or defrutum, to cheap wine and turned it into a drink that tasted rich and refined. The Roman elite were, quite literally, seasoning their lives with poison. They lived inside a lead capsule. They breathed lead, they ate lead, and they even drank it, while calling it sophistication. Did they have no idea it was dangerous? The reality is more awkward. One man warned them loudly and repeatedly, Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, the leading architect of his age. In his writings, he said it plainly, "Look at the plumbers." Vitruvius described workers in lead workshops as walking dead, pale skin, shaking hands, empty eyes, early death. He begged people to use clay pipes instead. Water from clay tastes better and is healthier, he insisted. But economics and laziness won. Clay pipes were heavy and fragile.
Joining them was difficult. Make one small mistake and you get a leak. And lead, a builder's dream, soft, bendable, easy to solder in minutes. Convenience outweighed common sense. Rome kept wrapping itself in metal, ignoring the trembling hands of the men who worked it. And here we reach the big paradox. If the pipes were poisonous, why did Rome not die out within a single generation? Why did legions keep marching and senators keep giving speeches? The answer lies in the water itself. It was very hard water coming from limestone hills, packed with calcium and magnesium. Within a few months of installation, the inside of a lead pipe built up a thick layer of calcium carbonate, simple limescale. That stony coating worked like an almost perfect barrier. The flowing water barely touched the metal. Nature created a protective layer, and in doing so, helped save millions of lives. Analysis of the bones of ordinary citizens shows, yes, their lead levels were above normal, but not usually fatal. The water system was not the main killer. The real irony is this: luxury killed. A poor plebeian drinking from a street fountain, water that had passed through scaled-up pipes, could be healthier than an emperor, because the ruler of the world drank expensive wine sweetened with lead sugar from a beautiful cup. Lead was a disease of the rich. But even if the water in the pipes was relatively safe, the place it went next could become a factory of death. Welcome to the Roman baths. To understand why Romans climbed into that water despite the risks, you need to grasp one thing. The baths were not just a place to wash, they were a whole world. Cities built enormous complexes that combined an elite gym, a public library, a shopping area, meeting halls, and something like a bar. And entry cost almost nothing, 1 quadrans, a quarter of an ass. Even the poorest drifter could afford that luxury every day. The baths were the great equalizer. A naked senator in the steam room looked no different from a naked butcher, except perhaps for softer muscles. A Roman did not come for 30 minutes to rinse off road dust. He came to live. First to the palestra to play ball or lift weights and work up a heavy sweat, then to the library to discuss the latest news or gossip about the emperor's lovers with an air of importance.
Then a massage as slaves kneaded muscles and rubbed in expensive oils, and only then came the slow journey through rooms of different heat, from the warm tepagarium to the brutally hot caldarium. Emperors understood the magic of baths perfectly. They were the most efficient way to buy the people's love. Agrippa, Augustus' son-in-law, saw it first. He built lavish baths and made entry free for an entire year. It was political narcotic. The formula of power was simple: bread, spectacles, and hot water. A clean plebeian is a calm plebeian. After 3 hours in a marble hall under a mosaic ceiling, a man feels like a citizen of a great empire, not a ragged nobody. He thinks less about revolt and more about the greatness of Caesar. But this imperial obsession with scale backfired. Rulers began competing not in quality, but in size.
The baths of Caracalla could hold about 1,600 people at once. The baths of Diocletian, up to 3,000. The scale was staggering. 3,000 sweaty, dirty bodies in one enclosed space. And here, physics takes over. Yes, aqueducts delivered millions of liters of water, but even their power was not enough to constantly replace the water in such massive pools. Filling the main basin took days, sometimes weeks, so the water was not changed after each visitor. It was not even changed daily. The more grand the architecture became, the faster the water turned into broth. Thousands of people washed off olive oil, sweat, road dust, flakes of skin, and fluids from sick bodies into the same stagnant liquid. By evening, a luxurious pool became a cloudy sludge coated with a greasy film. And that sludge became a perfect biological weapon, one the Romans willingly tested on themselves every day.
Step into the hottest hall, the caldarium. The air is wet. Steam hangs thick. The water temperature sits around 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. For a human body, it feels like bliss. Every muscle relaxes. But for microbiology, it is an invitation to attack. Warm, standing water without disinfectants is an ideal incubator. At that temperature, E. coli can double roughly every 20 minutes. The maths is simple. One person with stomach trouble enters, and there were thousands like that in Rome, and within an hour, the pool is crawling with bacteria. By evening, the concentration of pathogens could be so high that one accidental swallow could send you to meet your ancestors, and Romans dove in head first. Doctors were not blind. Galen, the great medical authority of the 2nd century, clearly saw the connection.
He wrote directly that visiting public baths was a reliable path to ophthalmia, a severe, pus-filled eye infection. Galen served as personal physician to Emperor Marcus Aurelius and gave him practical advice. If you want to live, do not go to the public baths. The emperor listened and washed in private quarters. An ordinary plebeian had no such choice: stay dirty or risk your eyesight. And the harshest part began when it was time for cleaning. Soap did not exist. Instead, they used olive oil and a strigil, a curved metal scraper. The procedure looked like this. A slave rubbed the body with oil, waited for dirt to loosen, and then scraped the layer off with force. The scraper was of course not sterile. It scratched the skin, leaving hundreds of tiny cuts. Then the person, with fresh wounds, sat bare-skinned on a marble bench, where 100 others had sat before, people with boils, fungus, and open sores. Infection could enter the bloodstream instantly. A normal trip to get clean often ended with severe skin infection, gangrene, or sepsis. And if microbes killed slowly, the building itself could kill in an instant. Romans were proud of their hypocaste system,
Underfloor heating powered by hot air from furnaces below. Brilliant, as long as everything stayed sealed. But if a crack appeared in the floor, carbon monoxide could seep into the steam room. It has no smell. A visitor would feel pleasantly tired, close his eyes, slip under the water, and never wake up. Death in the baths became so common it turned into a literary cliché. After surviving this palace of steam and danger, a Roman usually felt nature calling. And he headed for the most humiliating place in the whole city, the public toilet.
After the bath, the visitor went to the latrine, and here, everything you think you know about privacy disappears. No stalls, no partitions, no solitude. You enter a spacious room. Along the walls runs a long marble or stone bench. Neat holes are cut into it at regular intervals, 20, 30, and in big cities like Ostia, up to 80 seats, side by side. You sit down, and half a meter away, staring you in the face, sits your neighbor, a fish seller from the Forum. On the other side, a senator is making a deal with a contractor, and everyone is doing the exact same thing. To us, it feels unthinkable. To them, it was normal. Greco-Roman culture did not treat the body as shameful. The body was a machine that did what it had to do. Shame belonged to bad actions, betrayal, cowardice, not to physiology. More than that, latrines functioned as an unofficial club.
In this atmosphere of total openness, people spoke more freely than they did in the Senate. They gossiped, negotiated, settled business. Cicero once boasted that he learned details of a political plot in a toilet. It was a place where masks fell away and people spoke plainly. Now look at the engineering. Right by your feet, along the bench, ran a narrow channel of flowing water. It was used to rinse the hygiene tool, but that water did not stay in place. It flowed along the entire row. The person sitting at the end of an 80-seat bench received water that had already washed past the waist of 80 people. It carried everything they left behind, and with the smallest splash, it could throw a mist of bacteria and tiny fecal particles into the air, onto skin and into lungs. The person near the start got cleaner water.
The job is done, and your hand reaches for something to clean yourself. Paper has not been invented. Instead, standing in a bucket of cloudy water, there it is, the tersorium, also called the xylospongium, a sea sponge tied to a stick. And here the real nightmare begins. The tersorium was reusable, and it was shared. One sponge for everyone, from patrician to slave. You pick up the same stick that a person with a rash just used. You do what you must do, and then you simply rinse it in the flowing channel, or dip it into a bucket of vinegar. Romans genuinely believed vinegar and salt water killed disease. It was a fatal misunderstanding. Vinegar might slightly disturb bacteria, but it did almost nothing against worm eggs. Archaeology confirmed this with brutal clarity. At excavations of the fort of Vindolanda in Britain, researchers found preserved tersoria.
Under a microscope, they saw the horror. The sponges were packed with eggs of whipworm and roundworm. One infected person visited the latrine, used the sponge, and left a gift. The next 10, 20, 50 visitors, using the same stick, mechanically rubbed parasites straight into their own bodies. It was a Helminth transmission conveyor belt, running smoothly for centuries. But if the sponge on a stick killed slowly, the toilet itself could kill instantly. Roman sewers lacked a water trap, the curved section of pipe that blocks smells. The pipe ran directly to the main sewer. It was an open route. Gases from rotting waste, methane, hydrogen sulfide, rose freely, straight into the room. The latrine became a pocket for explosive gas. Sometimes methane levels reached a critical point. A visitor entered with an oil lamp or a torch to light a dark corner, and an explosion followed.
Roman sources describe cases where flames shot up from toilet openings, burning or killing people. Citizens were superstitious. They believed demons lived in the sewers and spat fire. They carved protective charms and images of the goddess Fortuna on latrine walls, hoping to walk out alive. But these were not demons. It was physics, and poor ventilation. All of it flowed from the latrines into the main underground artery of Rome, into its dark heart, the Cloaca Maxima. Under your feet, beneath the shine of marble and the bustle of markets, a monster lived. You did not see it, but at night you could hear its roar. Its name was the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer. Not a triumph of engineering, but the city's insatiable stomach. It was born long before Caesar. The old Etruscan kings, practical and ruthless, grew tired of the stench of a swamp in the center of the settlement. They drove slaves to dig a giant trench. Later, when Rome grew rich, they covered the trench with a stone vault to hide the shame. But the shame did not vanish. It simply moved underground. Everything went into that dark belly. Blood and offal from slaughterhouses, turning the flow brown. The contents of millions of chamber pots, dumped straight out of windows. Dead cats and dogs, and sometimes the bodies of poor people with nobody to bury them. This mixture crept beneath the streets and, with a satisfied gurgle, poured straight into the Tiber. Not on the outskirts, but in the heart of the city, near the cattle market. Downstream, the river turned into poison. Drinking it was suicide. But Romans, without a trace of shame, used that same water to irrigate vegetable gardens. And the contaminated produce was sold back in the very same markets. Sometimes the monster woke up. The cloaca connected directly to the Tiber. When autumn rains came and the river swelled, the flow pushed back. Water surged into the sewer and forced its contents back up into the city. People called it a backflow. On the ground floors of apartment blocks, in the homes of the poor, chaos began. Black, thick sludge seeped from under the floor. It burst from drains. It filled rooms up to the waist. Rats and excrement floated through it. Families grabbed their children and fled upward, while their homes drowned. When the water finally receded, a thick layer of sticky silt clung to the walls. About a week after the flood, an epidemic rolled through Rome: dysentery, typhus, cholera. The sewer, meant to cleanse, became a killer that visited every home. But even when it functioned normally, the sewer fed one more threat. It landed on every Roman's table, alongside crunchy bread and fresh vegetables. You would think it could not get worse, but the Romans decided waste should not go to waste, and they turned their filth into food. Agricultural writers Columella, Varro, gave farmers clear instructions. The best fertilizer is human. The city had a whole class of workers for this, the sterturari. At night they emptied cesspits, loaded the contents onto carts, and hauled it outside the walls to sell. A farmer generously spread it over beds of cabbage and lettuce. The vegetables grew huge and juicy, and along with them, worm eggs thrived on the leaves and in the soil, calmly surviving the journey from chamber pot back to the dinner table. It was a perfect closed cycle of self-infection. A Roman ate salad and swallowed parasites. The parasites multiplied. They left the body naturally. They were collected, hauled to the fields, and used to fertilize the next salad. The loop closed. Archaeology is unforgiving. In the year 2016, researchers at Cambridge studied fossilized Roman feces, coprolites. The results were shocking. Civilized Romans with aqueducts and baths had more parasites than Iron Age people or medieval peasants. In hygiene, they lost to the barbarians they despised. This hit the army especially hard. The legions, the pride of the empire. We like to imagine they died by the sword. Nonsense. The main killer of a legionary was diarrhea. In military camps, overcrowding was extreme. One sick soldier who failed to wash his hands could disable an entire century within a week. Non-combat losses from dysentery and infection often outweighed battlefield deaths by several times. Elite troops could not form up because half the men could not get off the latrine. Discipline is powerless against an amoeba. This endless circulation of dirt prepared the ground for a blow the empire would not recover from, a blow that came from the east.
The thunder struck in the year 165 AD. Rome stood at the peak of its power. Legions returned from the east from a victorious campaign against Parthia. They brought gold, slaves, silk, and an invisible passenger inside their bodies. In the capital, people began collapsing in the streets. The symptoms were horrific: fever, a dry throat, a rash that turned into black scabs. People seemed to rot while still alive. Their breath stank, their eyes inflamed. Death arrived on the 7th to the 9th day. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in panic, summoned Galen, but even a medical genius was powerless. He walked the palace wearing a mask soaked in perfumes and left a description of the hell around him. Most likely it was smallpox. Rome became a trap. Every achievement of civilization now worked against its creators. Overcrowded baths became engines of transmission. One sick person in a pool could infect hundreds. Latrines, markets, cramped apartment buildings, everywhere death harvested. The disease raced along roads faster than messengers. The numbers are chilling. At the peak of the epidemic, Rome lost around 2,000 people a day. Burial crews collapsed under the load. Bodies were piled onto carts and carried beyond the walls. Cemeteries overflowed. Marcus Aurelius authorized mass graves. Over 15 years, the plague wiped out roughly a third of the empire's population. Villages emptied. Fields turned to weeds because nobody was left to plow them. Border legions stood half full. Barbarian tribes could take them with bare hands. The Antonine Plague marked the beginning of the end. The water system and public baths, created for health, became a conveyor belt of death. The empire took a blow it never truly caught its breath from.
After the nightmare of the plague, the authorities began to realize they were sitting on a powder keg. But the response was late and weak. Emperors occasionally tried to impose order. Vespasian introduced fines for blocking the Cloaca Maxima. On paper, it was law and order. In reality, it was impossible to enforce. In a city of roughly 1 million people, you could not watch everyone. People waited for nightfall and kept throwing everything into the drains. Garbage, animal remains, even bodies. Guards caught a few. The city kept drowning. Domitian went further, switching into pure tyranny. He introduced the death penalty for dumping bodies into the Tiber, but he failed to understand the reason. People did it out of desperation. The poor could not afford proper funerals. They kept disposing of the dead, now just more quietly. They tried to regulate the baths as well.
Hadrian introduced separate visiting times for men and women. He wanted to fight immorality and accidentally helped hygiene a little. Fewer bodies were packed into the water at once. There was slightly less filth. But water still changed rarely. It cost too much. The Stoics saw the truth and shouted about it. Marcus Aurelius wrote in disgust in his private notes, "The water in the baths is oil, sweat, dirt, and every kind of foulness." He knew he was bathing in human broth. But even an emperor's authority could not break habit. The plebeians kept going. They had little choice. Either you washed in shared grime and felt like a citizen, or you walked around stinking. For ordinary people, it was a matter of dignity. And then Christianity arrived, and accidentally saved many lives. Preachers hated baths not because of microbes, but because of nudity. Purity of the soul matters more, they proclaimed. People listened. Christians visited these palaces of temptation less often. Mortality statistics began to fall. Less contact meant less infection. By the 4th century, the great baths began to empty, not because of decrees, but because fashion changed. When new waves of barbarians arrived, they looked at these complexes as useless mountains of stone and sometimes turned them into stables. The halls of Caracalla and Diocletian became ruins. The empire was dying. Aqueducts broke down, and as Roman civilization collapsed, it finally stopped killing its own citizens with its own water. If this story made you see ancient Rome differently, and you realized those white togas were not so white after all, subscribe to the channel. We dig up the real life of the empire, the kind that smelled of sweat, blood, and rot. In the next episode, we will tackle Roman medicine, battlefield surgery without anesthesia, skull drilling, and cataract treatment with a rusty needle. Turn on notifications so you do not miss it. Rome did not fall only to barbarian swords.
it was weakened by its own greatness. They built aqueducts to give the city water, and in the end they also gave it poison. They raised colossal baths for health and created factories of death. The denser the city became, the faster epidemics spread. Roman hygiene was a triumph of engineering and a disaster of epidemiology. They built for the gods, yet lived among microbes they did not even know existed. Perhaps this constant struggle to survive in a toxic environment helped shape the Romans into who they were. They conquered the world not because they were healthy, but in spite of it. But the price was monstrous. In Rome, every second child did not live to the age of 5, not because of war or famine, but because of the water they were so proud of. Rome's great, clean, deadly water.